I'm super excited to be here today. Welcome to Pi WebConf for everyone here. I know it's the first day, so I'm pumped to be kicking us off in the cloud space, as well as some other great presentations this morning. So my name is Kristi Perreault. I'm a principal software engineer at Liberty Mutual Insurance and an AWS Serverless hero. And today we're going to be talking about best practices for deploying well-architected serverless Python applications with the CDK. And I know that's a little bit of a mouthful for us this morning. I put together a quick agenda just so you kind of know what we're going to be running through today. It is totally okay if you have not heard of or used the CDK before. It definitely helps to have a little bit of background knowledge, but if you don't, definitely don't panic. We'll talk a bit about that and why I chose to talk specifically about CDK today. We'll go into a little bit on the specifics of Python CDK, and I'll share some really awesome Python specific tools with everybody here. We will also define what well-architected is, and I will talk about some of the best practices that we can follow. And then I will include a section for just tons of other resources to look into. As you'll see as I'm going through this, this is a pretty large topic and tons of great resources to take advantage of, and I want to make sure I pass that on to everyone here. So I will definitely be sharing those. So just for a little bit of background, I wanted to put in this slide about Liberty Mutual Insurance, mostly to showcase just how large we are. So we're an insurance company and we exist to help people embrace today and confidently pursue tomorrow. And we do that by promising protection for the unexpected delivered with care. We are number 78 on the Fortune 100 list. We're the 6th largest global property and casualty insurer. And we are in nearly 30 countries and economies worldwide. And what a lot of people don't know is that we have roughly 45,000 employees, and about 5,000 of those actually sit in technology specific roles. So the biggest takeaway here is that we're just a very large enterprise, and we do a ton of modern application development within the cloud space. These are just some of our recent kind of awards or things that you might have seen. We've been recognized for a lot of our DE&I efforts and for being a really great place to work. And normally I wouldn't push this too much, but just given the state and the climate of technology today and a lot of people experiencing the tech layoffs, did just want to share that if this is of interest to you, if you are looking or know someone who is, definitely feel free to check out our website, lmi.co/tech. We are actively hiring and do have open positions, so please pass it along for someone who may need it. And with that, just a little bit more on myself. So as I mentioned, my name is Kristi Perreault. I'm a principal software engineer at Liberty Mutual. I've actually been here my entire professional career. So that's been about 5 years since my internship and my college experience. And I've actually spent most of that time in the cloud and specifically in the serverless engineering space. I've worked a lot in Java Spring Boot, Python, obviously, as well as Node TypeScript. And I've mostly spent the last 3 or 4 years just solely focused on serverless enablement, cloud education, and developer tooling. I was part of the AWS Community Builders program for a short while, and then transitioned into a AWS Serverless Hero role in June last year, which I'm super excited about. I love taking part in the community. I love doing speaking events. I love sharing knowledge and knowledge transfer across with other professionals in the tech industry. I also hold a master's degree in electrical and computer engineering, which I obtained from Boston University back in January of 2021. So if anybody didn't think that the pandemic was exciting enough, I decided to work full-time and also go to school at night. But I did take a lot of cloud computing, AI and ML classes through my degree, so pretty cool. I've lived in a bunch of different places, Boston, Colorado. I spend quite a lot of time in Europe, but I currently reside in my home state of New Hampshire, where I am one of the co-organizers for the AWS Portsmouth user group. And I am also very involved in the women in tech communities and work a lot with women who code. So now that that's out of the way, I want to talk really high level, first of all, about cloud development so that you kind of have a frame of reference for the space that we'll be talking about today. So I like to break down this idea of cloud development into 2 pieces. And the first is that you have your business logic code, and this is your application code. So this is everything that you would kind of expect to write, maybe in your Python application, things for your web page to work, or your mobile app, or your product, or your service, in any language of your choosing. The other piece of cloud development, which is slightly newer or isn't necessarily something that in the past we've had to kind of take on ourselves, is this area known as infrastructure as code, or IAC. And these are the building blocks of your application. So these are the services and the resource within the cloud, the compute, the storage, the networking, the AI and ML spaces. So this is where you actually write code to define all of that infrastructure for the pieces of the code that you need. And you can define your resources however way you want. The good news is you have a lot of options to do this. And so the two kind of main ways to define your infrastructure as code would either be in a configuration language like YAML or JSON, or defining your infrastructure as code in your language of choice. You can probably tell from this presentation which one I'm going to be talking about the most today, but I think that this just helps to kind of frame our mindset for where we're headed. So there's kind of this space. AWS has a couple tools, AWS CloudFormation or CloudFormation templates, SAM, which is the serverless application model. And then there's some other party tools from Serverless Framework, as well as Terraform, that you can define your infrastructure as code in that YAML or JSON configuration language. I very much enjoy YAML too sometimes. I've started my career using CloudFormation templates. I sometimes still build SAM projects as well. I think that this is a great tool, and it's super helpful for your building blocks of your infrastructure as code. And it helps you kind of understand a little bit as you dive into more of the defining the language of your choice tools. So the two that I know of that are very strong in this community are Pulumi and CDK. Obviously, we're going to be talking a lot about CDK today, but both of these options allow you to define your infrastructure in your coding language of choice, not just a configuration language. So obviously here we want to talk about Python, but they are support for Node TypeScript as well as for Java and C. The point that I want to get across, though, is there's actually no like vendor lock-in sort of deal here. Once you choose one, that's not the end all be all. I'm using this example of CDK to kind of showcase that you can have CDK constructs in your Pulumi code. You can also import SAM or CFT templates within your CDK files. And Terraform even has a module for CDK known as CDK TF. So there's a lot that you can take advantage of and work between all of these different tools. So don't feel like one is better than the other, or that you have to make a choice and completely commit to it the entire time. There is room for flexibility and for movement here, and for you to try out different languages and different types of tools if you so choose to. So I grabbed this definition of what CDK actually is from the AWS website. And I both love and I hate this definition because it is very high level, but it also means it is super vague. So AWS defines CDK as a tool that accelerates cloud development using common programming languages to model your applications. So it's a pretty straightforward definition, but it actually dives into absolutely no detail or helpful details of what CDK is and what it does. So I want to clarify a little bit by talking about why I'm choosing CDK as the option to go through this. And some of this is I have a lot of expertise in this area. If you even Google Liberty Mutual and CDK, we're kind of known industry-wide for doing a lot of work in the CDK space. But there's a lot of reasons for that. And first, if you are a avid Python developer like myself, it's very easy to utilize the CDK and to take advantage of it. It's right alongside your application Python code. You import it just like you would any other library in your requirements file, and with an import statement, and you can interact with it fairly straightforward and easy. It's flexible, as I already kind of demonstrated. You can work with tons of different infrastructure as code languages. You're not just pigeonholed into CDK. And there are different levels of constructs. So they have the concept of L1, L2, and L3. So you can work with the very basic bare bones kind of CloudFormation base, or you can use something that's a little bit more advanced and all encompassing for the services and features that you're looking for. So it's really flexible to play around with and to work with and to configure. As a developer, I know that documentation is not always the best in the tech world. I would say that the CDK docs are pretty good. I'm a big fan of using the CDK API. One thing that I really like is this is actually written in TypeScript, but they utilize the JSII library to compile to other languages. And they didn't just compile it and like leave it alone. They've actually gone through and cleaned up a lot of what the Python guidelines are and what the documentation is for Python. So I think that it's really easy to go through and like check out the docs, understand what's going on, know what configurations are open to you, know what services and tools you can utilize. So I'd highly recommend this. And this is also going to be included in my many resources that I'll be sharing. CDK is in a unique position where it is open source. So there's a lot of community development here. You can go on GitHub and open an issue, and you can also track it and contribute to it. But it's also managed by AWS. So there is a team at AWS that has full-time employees dedicated to supporting CDK and the CDK experience. So it's kind of got one foot in the open source space with community developers, but also you kind of have that safety and security of it being backed by a very large cloud provider and enterprise. And finally, and probably the strongest reason and my most favorite for utilizing CDK is that this is something that the community has really rallied around and gets really excited about, which means that there is a ton of content and things to take advantage of for CDK. Both internally at my company, we have a lot of that, as well as the external community has grown really strong around this. So there's tons of people who have experimented with this, worked with it, have created solutions for it, and have shared it. So these are just a quick screenshot of all the great things that are out there with CDK. AWS has provided a CDK workshop that makes it really easy to go through and create your own sample app, walks through a bunch of different scenarios, and you can do that in Python as well. There's the cdkpatterns.com website and the cdkconstructs.com website, where you can find those L1, L2, and L3 constructs, as well as full-fledged patterns or blueprints that you can take advantage of to get started in CDK and in your Python development. And then there's some really cool resources. The CDK book does a really great job of explaining things like those level constructs I just mentioned, as well as the different types of testing you can do, and some of the other great resources. I am also on the organizing committee for CDK Day, which happens every year completely virtually. We have a very diverse organizer group, and we always have a ton of different diverse talks coming from all facets of the CDK community. So there's a ton of great support here. And this is really an area that we've invested a ton in both as an enterprise and as well as in the community. So that is my sort of intro spiel about CDK and the informative kind of part of this discussion for the background that you need to kind of learn a little bit more about Python CDK specifically. So just taking a quick beat here, going forward, there's going to be quite a few screenshots and code snippets and things that I want to share. I've gone through this presentation quite a few times, and there is a ton of content. So I just want to make sure that folks are aware that this is definitely going to be a lot, and I don't want to overwhelm anybody. So feel free to take screenshots. I'll share the slides out after. I'll share all the resources. It might feel a little like rapid fire, but I thought that it was more important to showcase a lot of the really cool libraries and spend time going through a bunch of different ones rather than just diving into one or two completely fully into a deep dive. So if it feels a little fast, don't worry about it. I'm a visual learner, so I liked including a lot of the screenshots so that you could kind of see in the code what this looks like, or you can just listen to me talk. That's totally fine too. But hopefully this ends up being somewhat helpful for you. So I want to start with showing what CDK code actually looks like for those that may or may not have experience in the CDK space. So on the left, this is just a CDK sample app straight from a CDK init. So this is what you would get out of the box picking just a sample application. And it's roughly 6 lines of code. And you can see that it's defining an SQSQ an SNS topic, as well as an SNS subscription. So there's 3 different types of resources here that it's creating for us. And then you can run a command in CDK called CDK synth that will actually generate the CloudFormation template for you that you just created with the CDK app. And as you can see, I don't expect you to read this, but there is a ton of code that gets generated in JSON. So these 6 lines of code have replaced everything in that screenshot on the right. So that's a huge advantage of being able to utilize CDK. And actually, this isn't even the full output of the template. I had to omit some of it so that it wasn't so ridiculous on this and so that it would fit completely on my screen. So this is a huge reason why folks like us at Enterprise really enjoy using CDK, because not only is it comfortable in our language of choice, but it also reduces the amount of complexity and the amount of lines of code that we're using. The second piece of the actual CDK structure is the project structure. And this is actually something that you won't get out of the box. This came from a blog post by Alex Pulver a couple of years ago. And my team found this and really liked the way that he broke down the Python CDK structure. And we started adopting this into our out-of-the-box skeleton patterns. So I want to share this because I feel like it's not talked about enough, and I feel like it's not understood enough. So basically, he has said that you have your configuration files at the root of your project like you normally would. So your requirements.txt, your app.py, your constants.py, any of your tests or anything, that stays completely the same. But once you start getting into your application code and your infrastructure as code, typically in a CDK init, you would get just sort of like a one infrastructure.py file, and you'd put everything in there. So you'd put all your databases, your Lambda functions, your API gateway, everything you want in that infrastructure.py, and that creates your CloudFormation stack for you in AWS. What he proposes is actually breaking this out into more logical units. And these aren't separate stacks, but they're more like separate constructs that come together to form your CloudFormation stack. So in this example here, he shows like an API section and a database section. We've done this on my team where it's been an API section and then a storage section, and then maybe even just a runtime section that has all of your Lambda functions in it. But the idea is that each of your infrastructure.py files actually defines the specific infrastructure pieces you needed for that logical unit. So like a storage one would have maybe a DynamoDB table and an S3 bucket. And then in your API infrastructure.py, you'll have everything to do with your API gateway within there. And the reason for this is that it does help you organize your thoughts a little bit better, but also it minimizes the size of that infrastructure.py, because even though we're saving a lot of space using CDK versus a regular CloudFormation template, there's still sometimes a lot of configuration you want to do, especially when it comes to API gateways. You can define tons and tons of different routes and need authorizers and all sorts of other resources around that. So this helps to section those out a little easier. And then you point to all of this as one large stack. So you just kind of combine these together in like an app.py, and it becomes your one stack. So if you are a Python CDK developer and you haven't heard of this or haven't tried it, I'd recommend checking it out. Again, you're not going to get it out of the box in like the CDK workshop or a CDK init. You'll have to move some things around to do this. But I think it's worth it. I really enjoyed this article, and I will definitely share that as well. So that's kind of your basics of CDK, some of it a little bit Python specific, but I want to talk about some of the Python libraries and tools that I've utilized within my CDK code for best practices, and just to make my life a little bit easier with Python development. So the first is a very common one. I think most folks in Python CDK world have used this or know of it. It's called Bodo, and it's basically just a fancy term for the AWS CDK available to you for Python. So you import it like you would any other library, bring it in your requirements.txt, and then you just do an import Bodo 3. And this is exactly how you would interact with all of those AWS services that I've been mentioning. So if you want to set up an API, if you want to set up a storage, component like S3 or a Dynamo table. In here, I also have CloudWatch available too. This is how you would interact with all of those services and set up those resources. So you create what's called a client or a resource, and that's just a boto3.client or boto3.resource, and you pass the name of it in. And then you can interact with it like you would any other kind of CRUD application. So you create alarms, delete alarms, you can list S3 buckets, you can create a queue, and then depending on what you're creating or deleting or updating, you'll have different configuration options available to you. And this is exactly why I said I like the CDK API, because they are much clearer on what the attributes are that you can configure within your Python code. And as you can see, again, these are all very small. It wasn't just an SQSQ and an SNS topic that has very little amounts of code. Even creating a queue can be done in basically one line. So this is a really cool library to take advantage of. And if you're doing any sort of Python CDK development, you will definitely be utilizing this. The next one is Lambda Powertools. If you haven't heard of this or haven't used it, I highly recommend that you do. It's basically just a library for observability best practices. And a lot of these code snippets actually come from a really great article from Tom McCarthy, who works at AWS. He put this out a couple of years ago, but it's still very relevant. And actually, they're actively developing in the Lambda Powertools space. They're releasing more support for other languages because it actually was only originally for Python before, which is kind of cool because usually it's the other way around and there's a lot of support for Node and TypeScript. But it's nice to see that this is getting a lot of use in Python and they're starting to replicate it across other languages. But it's a way for you to have best practices with your Lambda functions. So there's three key components of it, and that is the logger, the tracer, and the metrics. Again, import this as normal, and then you utilize these annotations on your Lambda functions. And the logger, for instance, will do, and if you do an inject Lambda context, you'll actually get a very nice, very neat JSON object in your CloudWatch logs that show you your function name, the ARN, the request ID, your location, the timestamp, and it's much neater. And if you've ever dug through logs, you'll know that this is super nice to have and makes it way easier to find and kind of look through your logs in CloudWatch. You can also use this as a regular logger, like within your application code as well. There's a tracer annotation. This is utilizing the X-ray tracer capabilities for AWS. It's kind of what it sounds like. It just traces the event and where your Lambda function is within the code. So it'll show you kind of visually in the AWS console, like where the requests are coming in from and what's triggering your Lambda function, and then what your Lambda function interacts with or what it might be triggering, and the type of events that get passed back and forth between them. So this is a cool way to kind of actually see what's going on in your full application in a more visual depiction with just a one-line annotation. And the last one is metrics. Metrics is really cool to take advantage of. It will show you kind of some out-of-the-box metrics like your performance, your memory, a little bit about your cold starts as well for Lambda functions. And you can do this thing where you can actually add metrics that you want to customize. So like this was an example for the shopping cart example for Amazon, and you can actually go through and do a count, unit count and value, and it'll show you that again visually in the AWS console. So these are cool ways to take advantage of different observability metrics and help you build in best practices with just a couple quick little annotations. This next one is actually one that I have not used, but I've heard quite a bit about. I'm excited to try it out. I'm excited to use it. It's called Tuna. If you are familiar with any sort of like performance analysis tools or profile visualers, it's actually built based off of Snakeviz. And it just goes to show you what your performance is in your application. And this is really helpful, again, for those Lambda cold starts. It's a simple CLI install. I think it's like 1 or 2 commands. And then you just use a command to either create a brand new profile or import one that you might want to run or use yourself. And then you use the tuna command and it generates this lovely little tree that I've screenshotted on the left as an example. And it just shows you your execution time and where you are spending the most time in your code. So for this one, it's showing like a 10-second execution time, and that foo.py 4a versus the foo.py 9b. They're both taking up exactly 50% of that time. So this is like a really simple out of the box example, but this can get really complicated, and it'll show you a full tree breakdown of exactly where you're spending a lot of time. And this would highlight where your cold starts are. So I haven't tried it myself. If you have tried it or know of it, would love to hear about your experiences with it. I've just heard that it's a super cool tool. It works really well. And this is directly from people that have worked with it and live and breathe Python CDK. So I trust them. So definitely check it out. Let me know how it goes. And I definitely have this on my list as well. The last piece that I want to talk to in the Python library space is specific to testing. And there are a lot of different things in testing. I pulled out 3 of them that I found pretty helpful. As most folks in the cloud space know, testing with cloud applications and CDK applications can be pretty difficult. It's not completely solved or perfect by any means at this point. But I will say that there's a lot of testing libraries that do help make your life a little bit easier, and can give you some fairly basic high level kind of coverage. The first is not CDK specific. PyTest is a big one in the Python community. I will say it does come out of the box when you create a CDK init project. So it automatically throws it in your imports for your testing dependencies, and they kind of stub out a couple tests depending on what sample application you use out of the box, but they will include the install in there. And these are your very typical assertion tests. So assert true, assert false, assert one of these or 2 of those. This is super helpful with your infrastructure tests. And what's cool about this is there is a CDK assertions library that utilizes the template keyword, and it checks different properties on your template, depending on what you want to kind of look at or check. So the screenshot that I have here is for a template.has resource properties. Basically just shows that there's a Lambda function, and then you can pick and choose which things you want to test. So maybe you want to get super granular and test every, like how you named it, what role it's using. This one's just testing to make sure, like, hey, does my template have a Lambda function? Is it called, does it have a handler? And does it have a node runtime? So you can do this with a bunch of different things. They have like a one for has resource count. So if you're expecting to have like 5 Lambda functions, you can actually assert, that you have 5 Lambda functions in here. So this is super helpful. There's some really cool assertion library and big options and definitions in here that you can play with. I've also included the link here and in my resource wrap up. The other one that is pretty Python AWS CDK specific is Modo. If you haven't guessed, that is Bodo's mock testing library. So it's basically part of that AWS CDK, but it's a mock testing library. And there's a couple different ways that you can utilize this. It's kind of what it sounds like. You mock out different services from AWS. So you might mock out your S3 bucket. You could mock out a Dynamo table. I don't think you can mock every single service, but those are 2 of the really popular ones. And you can do this in a couple of different ways. You'll also notice that this is combined with a PyTest fixture, so you can use those libraries together very seamlessly. And then this is one of the examples where you can define the mock itself, but there's ways where you can define it using a decorator or an annotation. You can define it as kind of like a raw mock and set up more of these configurations for yourself. So there's a couple different ways in the documentation that it shows you can go through this, which is kind of cool because it's really flexible for your style of how you want to develop, and it helps work with all your applications. The last one is not necessarily a testing library, but it is a really cool tool that I started using a couple of years ago. Again, it's not Python CDK specific, but it is really cool to utilize within your CDK code. It's called Talks. It's just a virtual environment manager for running all of your tests. And it has this neat little talks.ini file that you would keep at the root of your project. And you can actually define different test environments, different commands you want to run. You can set up your Python versioning. for your tests. And there's a lot of different cool configuration options you can do with this, but it's super cool because you can just run tox, and all your tests will run for you. Or you can pass them in individually, but it's a really neat little tool that you can utilize that simplifies a lot of your testing and a lot of your commands, and you can save some of your commands in here so that it just runs those. So it's a really neat tool. I do know that it's one that is attempting to be a standard across the Python community. So if you haven't used it, definitely check it out. One of my favorites. So that is a lot about Python specific libraries and tools that we can use within CDK. I want to talk a little bit about how we can use these to our advantage for developing with best practices and clean code. And AWS has this thing called well-architected. It is basically just a set of best practices that you want to follow when you're developing cloud applications. And there's 6 pillars as the well-architected framework. They're listed all right here: security, cost, operational excellence, reliability, performance, and sustainability. And the goal is not to get like 100% across the board with all of these. There's definitely some overlap between a bunch of them, but mostly it's to get you thinking about your application and what trade-off decisions that you want to make. So for instance, like you might have a really small budget and like your cost is the most important thing to you. So you could make some sacrifices maybe in the performance space or the sustainability space. Or maybe you work for a large enterprise like myself and security and reliability are completely top of mind. And that is really what you care about. That might mean that you spend a little bit more money on some stuff, or that maybe it's not as sustainable as you'd like it to be. So this is to get you thinking about how to build your applications in a way that optimizes the application for you, for your customers, for your users, and not meant to be really strict guidelines. So AWS actually has this as a service within the console, and you can go through a well-architected review. And there are a bunch of questions very specific to each of these pillars that you can answer. Again, just to get you thinking, some of these only have like 3 or 4 questions. I know the sustainability one has only been around for just over a year, so there's not a ton of guidance around that one yet. Some of these have 20 or 30 questions they might ask you. So I'd highly recommend to check it out, try it out with like one of your individual projects or your community projects, bring it into your company and check it out there too. It's kind of like a cool way to just get everyone on the same page and get a good understanding of it. We do a lot of well-architected reviews using the well-architected framework at Liberty Mutual. So it's something that we care a lot about and just covers a lot of our bases with best practices. There's also a bunch of different lenses associated with this. So for instance, there's like a serverless lens. So it's a couple additional questions if you have a very serverless specific application. They have like a data science lens as well. I think they might have one for like AI and ML. So there's a whole bunch of different lenses. They're always updating this documentation and this guidance. And actually the serverless lens was recently updated and includes a lot of really good examples about what type of apps might fall into this category. So it's definitely a cool thing to check out. In terms of well-architected with Python CDK, there's a lot of different things you can do here. It's not necessarily Python specific. However, there are certain things like you'll notice I put Lambda Powertools for a lot of these things. Lambda Powertools is literally a best practices for observability library. So you can check a lot of boxes on a lot of these pillars just by using Lambda Powertools because you can point to and say, you know what, like this is performant because we use Lambda Powertools and saw our metrics and optimized for our memory. Or you can say, you know what, we're using Lambda Powertools Tracer, and that's showcasing our operational excellence because we're really able to quickly identify, solve, and troubleshoot problems that are going on within the code. And then there's other pieces of this that are prevalent in a lot of other different IAC tools. So like for the security pillar, obviously you can define IAM roles and policies in AWS CDK Python, as well as the other tools, just like you could with CloudFormation or with the SAM template or Pulumi or something else. Minimizing cost, you can minimize maybe your API calls, or maybe it's something that you don't care much about. Reliability, doing database backups and snapshots, multi-region deploys, throttling your requests. Those things all kind of fall into that space as well. Again, all things you can do within the Python CDK environment. Sustainability is still a tough one. I think that there's a lot more guidance around if you're doing more like IoT or AI ML work. It's a little bit easier to kind of one-to-one compare that to the hardware. That is a bit tougher in the space of especially serverless or web applications. So I'm still waiting on some guidance for this, but I do like that they've added it, and it gets us thinking about, how much we're really using and taking advantage of optimizing for performance or for being sustainable. And one thing that I really think helps when you're thinking about well-architected practices is these are all things that you're going to want to continually do. It's going to look slightly different across your projects, but in some cases, you might want something that's really out of the box that fits your specific best practice needs and balances those 6 pillars to your liking or to your company's liking and understanding. So I put this together because we've created a bunch of kind of starter patterns or CDK skeleton patterns, as we call them too, that hit on all these points. And I also love that I use the phrase baked in, and apparently it gave me what appears to be a sushi roll. So I kept that because I thought it was hilarious. So there's actually no significance to using sushi here. I just thought it was funny. So these are just giving you your best practices out of the box. One of the biggest things for us is that your security and compliance are already baked in. So when we're at a large company and we're looking across the board, we want to make sure that everybody's using the same sort of restrictions and guidelines. So if we can bake that right into a beginner starter pattern, and that way, everybody can utilize it and take advantage of it, and we're consistent across the board, that helps a ton. It also allows you to kind of customize and build on the basics. So you can start with a starter pattern and you can go any which way you'd like with it. We've done some customization on this to ask things like, would you like a DynamoDB table or an S3 bucket, or do you want both? So it's a great way to kind of build on just these smaller sort of pieces and to put together your own application that's going to suit your needs. As I kind of alluded to, it does promote reuse and collaboration. This way, you're not reinventing the wheel every time. If you have a team over here and another team like way over on the other side, they might not always communicate or know what's going on. So having a starter pattern and sharing that across the board means that you've saved this other team a ton of work from creating their own thing from scratch and having to deal with things like that security, the compliance, and any sort of those basics. And naturally, this leads to a lot of community-driven development. So based on our starters and our skeleton patterns, a lot of people have turned around and said stuff like, hey, you know what, this is great, but I know I need to build 10 applications that use Fargate. So I'm going to build a Fargate pattern. And that way I can take advantage of it for my 10 apps and I don't have to reinvent it every time. And other people can take advantage of it too. So this is pretty cool. This is how things like CDK patterns, CDK constructs have really come to be. So I think that having a starter pattern is really great, even if you just utilize one from cdkpatterns.com or, put together a few constructs from the CDK construct hub. I think you're well on your way to creating a reusable, buildable, community-driven product. So there's a lot of information I threw at you today. Hopefully you learned a lot. This slide is, I think, just about everything I referenced or talked about. I'm happy to post this or share it or answer any questions about them too. So these are just AWS docs, different libraries and tools and blog posts that I referenced and we talked about, or I used screen grabs from and code snippets. So hopefully this was helpful. I know it was a lot. And even if you take 1 or 2 of these libraries back with you and check them out or learn a little bit more about them, that's great. If you have a ton of questions, I feel like that's a sign that you're definitely interested in some of these things, and that's all I wanted to accomplish today. So hopefully you do. And otherwise, that is it for me today. Feel free to follow me on Twitter or add me on LinkedIn. I always am happy to chat or answer DMs. Yeah, that's it for me.